There is no more serious problem facing life on Earth than climate change, and yet our progress in addressing it has been slow and unsteady. The problem of climate change can't be solved by one country or even a small group of countries, but requires a level of international cooperation and commitment the world has rarely seen. In the United States, some politicians take issue with the reality of climate change and the crucial need to address it, despite the scientific consensus that the threat is real and even existential. But behind the scenes, outside the glare of the political spotlight, are countless government servants working day and night to negotiate international agreements to reduce carbon emissions and prevent the worst-case scenarios. One of those people is Jennifer Haverkamp, currently the director of the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan, where she and her colleagues recently presented the university's president with a proposed plan for the university to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. Jennifer was a biology major who graduated first in her class at the College of Worcester, a Rhodes Scholar who earned a graduate degree from Oxford University, and a graduate of Yale Law School. After serving as an environmental lawyer at the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency, Jennifer accepted an opportunity to bring her environmental expertise to bear at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she learned the art of international diplomacy, particularly on environmental issues. Ultimately, the expertise she gained in that office resulted in her appointment with the State Department, where in 2016 she led 2 United States negotiating teams that successfully arrived at international agreements designed to reduce global warming and the risks of climate change. I recently spoke with Jennifer about her experience in these crucial areas of international environmental diplomacy, about the United States' international standing on environmental issues, and about why she is optimistic about the future of the planet. This is Don Frederico. Welcome to Higher Callings. I'm with Jennifer Haverkamp. Jennifer, it's good to see you. Welcome to Higher Callings.
Thanks so much, Don, for inviting me to be on your program.
And I think for the benefit of our listeners, we should just mention that you and I have known each other for quite a few years. We both attended the College of Worcester as undergraduates, and we both serve on the Board of Trustees of the college, and we have for quite a number of years. In fact, I was thinking about it today that we also have chaired the same committees at the College of Worcester, so we've kind of followed in each other's footsteps in that capacity, and it's been great to work with you and to see you as a leader on the Board of Trustees and watch the amazing work you've done there.
Thanks so much. It's fun to be joining you for this next venture of yours.
Jennifer, we could spend a lot of time talking about your very distinguished experience as a student at all levels. But what I want to do is really focus on your career in government. And after you graduated from Yale Law School, you served as a law clerk for 1 year for Judge Betty Fletcher in the Ninth Circuit. And from there, you went to the United States Department of Justice. What were you doing in the Justice Department, and what years were you there?
Sure. I went to Washington with the Justice Department, arriving, I guess, near the end of 1988, and went into the Environment Division, which was then called the Land and Natural Resources Division, and went into this very interesting little office that did a mix of policy, legislation, and special litigation work. And I did a variety of things in my 3 years there, but what I especially wonderfully stumbled into was I got there just as, after many years of deadlock, the incoming President Bush and Congress had decided that they were finally ready to work together on reauthorizing the Clean Air Act, the 1970 Clean Air Act you and I were talking about earlier.
Right.
And
And this was George H.W. Bush.
Yes, it was George H.W. Bush. And so I got to be part of the team at EPA and the Justice Department that was drafting the president's legislation. And I ended up kind of leading for that team the process of the revisions to the permitting and enforcement chapters, and coordinating a lot of DOJ involvement in other parts of the bill, and spending a lot of time in congressional offices. And it was just a really incredible experience, especially because at the end of it, we actually got the law passed. There's so many times in an advocacy career where you can throw yourself at something for years and it doesn't happen. Something doesn't happen. You have to pick yourself up and try again. And on this one, I managed to come near the end of lots of people trying, and we made it happen, which was great.
You were the right person in the right place at the right time.
At least the latter two.
And how long were you at the Justice Department, Jennifer?
3 years.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, this was, you clerked for a federal judge, so you were in the judicial branch for 1 year. And then you went to work at the Justice Department, so now you were in the executive branch. I mean, were you developing at the time an interest in government work beyond just the matters you were working on at the moment?
I would say yes. When I first was out of law school, I figured that I would probably end up in a career in environmental advocacy. And I think when I got to the Justice Department and saw just the incredible talent and commitment of my colleagues and the opportunities you had within government to make such a difference and get responsibility so early, it was just a really intellectually and mission-wise gratifying place to be working. And I don't think at the time I assumed it would be my entire career, but I was surrounded by people who had chosen to make it their entire career and were, doing great work.
And then you left the Justice Department, but you stayed in government. Tell us about your next move after Justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I went from Justice to the Environmental Protection Agency, where I was a special assistant to one of the political appointees who headed the Office of Enforcement and Compliance at EPA. So I kind of went from the litigator agency to the client agency, but still looking at how cases get brought forward, how they ask justice to litigate them, all the cases that they handle through the administrative law process instead, and worked on a variety of projects at EPA. But that I was only there for a year before, with the change of administration, with the Clinton administration coming in, I had, again, another one of these sort of unexpected opportunities to pivot in a new direction. And
yeah, tell us about that. You've told me this before, and I find it fascinating how that opportunity came about and how it really helped to shape your future to a large extent. Tell us what happened.
Sure. Yeah, I had no idea that I was making such a major turn in the road. But so when I was at EPA in 1992, the U.S. government with Canada and Mexico were negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, and environmental and labor issues had risen to become a very important part of those negotiations. A lot of the concern by people opposing the NAFTA were what effect it might have on the environment. And at the same time, there was a dispute between the U.S. and Mexico over a U.S. law that said that you could not export tuna to the United States if it was caught in a way that harmed dolphins. And, all the little dolphin safe tuna labels when you buy canned tuna. Well, that turned out to be illegal under the current international trade laws, that you were supposed to treat a can of tuna at the border the same, however it was caught. So those two things led to this clash between the trade world and the environment world. They discovered each other and they didn't like what they saw. So USTR, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the part of the Executive Office of the President that leads international trade negotiations, had to suddenly get smart on environmental issues. And they had borrowed a friend of mine from the Justice Department to help set that office up and work on those issues. And she had to go back to DOJ. And so she came to me and said, would you be interested in coming to USTR on loan from EPA? And I knew nothing about international trade. All my career up until that point had been pretty much entirely U.S. domestic law. But it just sounded like an intriguing new challenge and worth figuring it out. And I was, going on loan, so that was not terribly high stakes. And EPA signed the papers and sent me off to USTR.
How long were you there, Jennifer?
10 years.
Wow. So what were the positions you held there? It really is interesting. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans, right?
Mm-hmm,
and your life really happened at the U.S. Trade Representative Office. What kinds of matters did you work on? What positions did you hold? Tell us a little bit about that important work.
Sure. And again, it was a little bit like walking in the door at the right time. When I got to USTR, it was the beginning of the Clinton administration, and President Clinton had committed to negotiate side agreements on labor and environment to address the concerns of the opponents of NAFTA in those areas. And so I got put on one of the negotiating teams, and actually both. So I was involved in negotiating the labor and the environmental side agreements with Canada and Mexico. And then the whole process of taking NAFTA through congressional approval. And so that's probably where the international bug first really bit me. And working with folks in other countries to, and just the whole process of negotiation, of figuring out what the interests of the most important interests of those on the other side of the table were, and how you craft texts that address both concerns, and figure out what they really need and what they're just bluffing about in order to trade. It's just fascinating. So I did that.
So you were learning a skill that I guess is multilateral diplomacy,
right?
But one that had an environmental focus, because that was your background.
Exactly. And then USTR invited me to stay, in other words, take a job there and not go back to EPA. And so I was hired to be the deputy in that office, the new office they had created for environment and natural resources. And I'd just come back from maternity leave with my first child. I thought, this sounds like a great job. 2 months after I got there, the head of the office was moved over to become the head of the Europe office, and I was asked to become the head of the environment office, which was I was a little reluctant to do, but again, it seemed like a really great opportunity. And that's the job that I then had for the next 8.5 years. And in that job, we kind of covered we negotiated the environmental provisions that were being put into bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. We also were involved in the negotiation of trade-related provisions in international environmental agreements. One in particular that people might relate to was an agreement about international trade in living genetically modified organisms. So it was not a trade agreement, but it was so about trade. And then we also worked on all the disputes with other countries where the trade dispute had something to do with an environmental or natural resource policy or law that a country had.
It sounds like very exciting work. And were you traveling a lot in this position?
I was. It was it was a it was a very demanding time, and the USTR is another place where I think people are really dedicated. They work really hard. Um, I was in a policy office, so I'd moved away from being serving as the lawyer, but the general counsel's office, they worked them so hard that there was an expression I heard there once of, at USTR's general counsel's office, they burn the furniture. In other words, they work people so hard they're destroying their assets, which
That's a great turn of phrase.
yeah, not very
It
good
sounds
for
like it
lawyers.
sounds like working for a big law firm
Right.
when you're a young associate or something.
Yeah, but you've got incredible work.
Yeah.
And no, so it was always interesting, but it was a lot of travel. And but it's also just such a great place in which to see how policy is made and be part of making policy, because USTR, similar to the State Department, coordinates these policies across lots of agencies. So we were running processes where we had to hammer out disagreements across federal agencies in order to determine our negotiating position to then take internationally.
Now, I think you left there in 2003. I mean, I assume that in that office, just like many federal agencies, the personnel change when there's a change in administrations, especially if there's a change in the parties that are in power in politics. So you were there throughout most of the Clinton administration, maybe the whole Clinton
The entire Clinton
administration,
administration.
and then a little bit into the next Bush administration. And did you leave because it was a changeover of administrations, or was there something else that drove you to leave at that time?
I actually, I think, thought that I might be leaving with the changeover in administration, thinking there would not be a similar commitment to addressing the environmental dimensions in trade. But the U.S. trade representative that Bush appointed, Robert Zoellick, was actually very committed to these issues. And so, at least from the USTR perspective, there was a real continuity of policy. And the other reason I stayed for 2 years was, once the Republicans were in control of the executive branch, Republicans in Congress were willing to give them something called trade promotion authority to negotiate new international trade agreements, which they had not given to Clinton. And so I spent the next 2 years negotiating the environmental chapters of the U.S. Singapore and U.S. Chile bilateral free trade agreements, which was, a great fun. And then I was ready to leave, because going forward, there were going to be a lot more bilateral agreements, which we'd kind of set the template. And so there would be it'd be sort of something I'd already done. And I had 2 small children, and I'd been traveling a lot at USTR, and I was ready for a break.
So you described some of this work as great fun, and I really want to probe into that a little bit. What did you like about it so much? I mean, it sounds highly technical. It sounds very political in some ways, although maybe not in the way we often use the word political. But what did you enjoy about it? It sounds like you had a real passion for doing this kind of bilateral and multilateral international negotiation on trade. Where does that passion come from, and what did you like?
Well, I think again, for me, the passion was that it was the environmental issues in trade, right? So I think I could have had a similarly passionate career if I'd been at the State Department the whole time. But I think in part what made it so interesting was we were, if you will, cutting edge on trade and environment policy. In the 1990s and early 2000s was when this was all being sorted out. And so every day was interesting, even though it was often also very contentious. And so it really honed and drew on my diplomatic skills, within my own office, within my own federal government, much less once you got to the table with the other countries. And, you know, I would say the engagement with people in other countries and understanding how very different their perspectives could be on some of these same issues was interesting. The idea that by bringing environmental issues into the trade negotiations, the countries we were dealing with on the other side, the people who always negotiated their trade agreements realized they had to talk to their environmental agency counterparts. And so you were seeing a greater coherence in policymaking in the other countries by virtue of having to address these issues with us. And so that all made it interesting. The international travel, people who don't do it glamorize it. But we used to joke that the only way you know you're in Paris is if there's a croissant on your breakfast plate, because then you go into a room with no windows and sit and negotiate until midnight. And you could be anywhere. So.
Well, other than the croissant, I'm not sure that last part of your answer made it sound like much fun.
Well, that's it. I mean, it wasn't glamorous.
It's hard work.
It wasn't glamorous.
It's really hard work. And I'm curious, at least at the time you were there, what was the United States standing in the world on environmental issues in trade negotiations? Were we viewed as a leader? Were we, what was the perception of the United States in that particular space at that time?
In that space, I would say we were viewed by the advocacy community and those who were pushing environmental agendas as largely a leader. For a lot of the other countries, the people across the table were mostly traditional trade agency people who were not happy to be having to address these issues. And a lot of what was driving the US leadership was our domestic politics, where instead of a strong bipartisan support in Congress for trade liberalization, you had increasing concern about the impact of trade on the environment, on labor. And so the US pretty much was driven to address these concerns in our international agreements to have any hope of getting Congress to approve them when we brought them back home.
And I don't know this area at all, so I don't know if this is a good question or a dumb question, but it does strike me that one of the big challenges anytime you're doing international negotiations involving environmental issues is that the interests of the developed world are different from the issues and interests of the non-developed world or underdeveloped world. How much did that play a part in the work you were doing while you were at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative?
It was very, very much a dimension of our work. And an important aspect of that was if we were going to build into these agreements any obligations that those countries effectively enforce their environmental laws, that they maintain strong environmental laws, we also had to be willing to come forward with capacity building support that would help them, if they did not have an adequate system in place, move in that direction. And so often the trade agreements we were negotiating were accompanied by an environmental cooperation agreement that either EPA or the State Department led the implementation of. So there was actually quite a bit of environmental diplomacy that accompanied the trade agreements. So I think that was a general positive. I would say where people were willing to be critical was that it was the trade agenda that was prioritizing which countries were getting the support on environmental capacity building, rather than necessarily stepping back and saying which countries, for biodiversity reasons or human suffering reasons, ought to be our first priorities in this area.
How much of an impact did the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative have while you were there on environmental sustainability through trade?
I like to think quite a bit.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, it's not something we hear about a lot, right? The general public doesn't hear a whole lot about um, the environmental policy issues that are being negotiated in trade talks. I think the general public probably doesn't have much of a window into what that entails. And can you give some examples of some of the things that you feel you and your group accomplished while you were there?
so I don't know how deep you want to go into this.
Probably not too deep, but
So I think there are two ways to view this. One is um, through the lens of how are you using the opportunity of a trade negotiation to help move another country toward a stronger environmental regime. Um, and one of the probably examples that environmentalists like to point to actually happened after I left, but the U.S.-Peru free trade agreement included, actually at the insistence of Democrats in Congress, a very strong annex around forest protection that ended up being what caused Peru to create its first environmental agency. Um, where I would say we also had more impact than would maybe again be obvious to the general observer is in developing the rules, including through the disputes, to move the trading system to be much more understanding of and accommodating of a country's environmental regulatory measures that restricted trade, but for environmental reasons. So, navigating through that world so that trade was not a stifling of good environmental policy.
great. Thank you. So you left the office in 2003, and then what did you do after you left?
So there were about 4 years there when I did a combination of things. I was adjunct teaching part-time at Johns Hopkins Graduate School. I was doing a little bit of consulting. I was on an international team that did a 10-year review of the NAFTA environmental agreement that I'd negotiated 10 years before. But also, I was spending a lot of time parenting and focusing on my kids until 2007.
And what did you do then?
This is kind of funny, but again, people keep returning and popping back up in your life. The same friend who had the position at USTR, who went back to the Justice Department, was at Environmental Defense Fund and was going out on maternity leave, and they were looking for someone to lead their team to the international climate negotiations.
What is the Environmental Defense Fund?
The Environmental Defense Fund is a large, sophisticated U.S. nonprofit or non-governmental organization. It has offices around the U.S. and in several other countries. It prides itself on finding the ways that work, that they bring economics as well as science and law together to solve problems. And they're a very, very effective advocacy organization.
And so was this your first involvement in climate change work?
It is. In fact, before I took that position, I knew that climate change was really, really important, and I was so glad that other people were working on it. And then I went to EDF, and they had an international climate program, and I became the head of that group, leading the work to the UN climate negotiations in particular. But that expanded out to a fair number of bilateral initiatives that EDF was also pursuing at the time.
Okay. And then after a number of years at EDF, you went back into government at the State Department. We talked about that briefly at the beginning of the interview. But can you, tell us how that came about, what you were brought in to do, and then what matters did you work on while you were at the State Department?
Sure. So basically, when President Obama was reelected, and I saw, a strong commitment to environment and climate, I thought, well, my kids are getting older. I can maybe go back into one of these incredibly demanding jobs in government again. And so I started putting out some feelers and had the honor of being invited to go to the State Department. It's a saga I won't get into, but I was actually nominated to a Senate confirmed position at a point in the process where very, very few, I would say no environmental appointments were getting approved by the Republican controlled Senate anymore. And so the State Department created the position of Special Representative for Environment and Water Resources and brought me in. And
what were they working on at the time that they wanted to get you involved in?
Well, there were more international environmental and climate negotiations than there were people to lead them, frankly, and especially people with multilateral negotiating experience, which I had from my years at USTR.
Right.
And so there was, what you hear about the most, which is the Paris Climate Agreement, which was just being concluded in 2015. But then there were two other lesser known.
Wait, so in 2015, when did you go to the State Department? Was it right after that had been concluded?
Right then, yeah.
Okay.
So beginning of 2016. But there were two other negotiations that were also on track, if possible, to be completed in 2016. And so I led those two negotiating teams.
What were those agreements?
So one is ended up being called the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol is the international environmental agreement dedicated to eliminating the hole in the ozone layer by international agreement to phase out the use of the chemicals that cause the hole in the ozone layer. And there's a chemical called hydrofluorocarbons, a class of chemicals called hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are not very ozone depleting. So they're a good substitute for the other ozone depleting chemicals.
And these are used in air conditioning, is that, or refrigeration?
Yeah, they're used in air conditioning and refrigeration in particular. They have some other purposes too, like making foam and metered dose inhalers for asthma sufferers. But they turn out to be an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. And so extremely important to agree to a phase down of use of HFCs, because if you didn't, the world was getting warmer, the world was rightly getting richer, and so there was more and more need for air conditioning, more and more need for refrigeration of processed food. And if we didn't switch to substitutes to HFCs, it was really going to exacerbate climate change. And so
do I understand this right? HFCs came in to help as a substitute for what had been used because it was better for the ozone layer.
Exactly.
But now that people were starting to focus on climate change, they realized that HFCs were much worse for climate change.
Exactly.
And so you were working on the negotiations to try to phase those substances out in order to reduce the impact on climate.
Right. And not to go on a big detour, but it made for a very complicated negotiation because the Montreal Protocol was not a climate forum. It was not a climate agreement.
It was an ozone agreement.
It was an ozone agreement. And so there was a big culture shift and also the pressure of all the politics of climate coming over into this other forum. But we reached agreement to phase down HFCs significantly. Analysts have calculated that the agreement as implemented will avoid up to 0.5 degree of global warming this century.
Celsius, right?
Yeah. Celsius.
For those who are really keeping track of what's Celsius and what's Fahrenheit, just in case somebody is doing those calculations.
So just right there, I mean, an incredible professional rush to be able to say, I played a little part in helping to avoid 0.5 degree of global warming.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like it was more than a little part. You were leading a negotiation team.
Okay.
And then I know you're very modest. And just to go off track for a second, you've done amazing things throughout your career. I've known you for a number of years through our board work together. I never hear you talk about this. You don't brag. You're very unassuming. And that's why it's such a pleasure to bring these things out in your interview.
Well, that's very kind. I guess I'm just very much a Midwesterner.
You are, which is a good thing. And then there was the aviation agreement. Now, I've always understood that planes, jets are one of the biggest contributors to climate change and greenhouse gases. So tell us a little bit about what you were doing with this aviation agreement.
That was really interesting. So bear with me a moment. The UN climate agreement that everybody hears about, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Agreement, those are where countries take responsibility for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in their own territory. So where else do greenhouse gas emissions happen? International aviation for planes flying back and forth between territories, and international shipping. And so those two sectors, shipping and aviation, basically fell outside of the UN climate agreements. And so what we were doing was, in the UN organization responsible for global civil aviation, it's called ICAO, and it's based in Montreal. Long story of pressure to finally get ICAO countries to agree to negotiate a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from civil aviation. And as you said, they're huge emitters. The main source of their emissions are the fuel that they burn. And so it's pretty hard to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from an airplane. I mean, they've made planes a lot lighter. They put those little wing tips on the edge of the wings so that they fly more efficiently. But the main tools that aviation has to reduce their emissions are to come up with more efficient engines, to switch to sustainable biofuels, to improve air traffic control so that they spend less time circling airports. But there's really not much else. And those are not going to get you to carbon neutrality. Maybe eventually the biofuels will, but there are a lot of issues to be solved there. So the agreement that we negotiated was a commitment to limit emissions from civil aviation, international civil aviation, to their 2020 levels. And for anything above 2020 levels going forward, countries would have to purchase high quality offsets from some other greenhouse gas reduction in some other sector. And there are a lot of details I won't bore you with in terms of gradually ratcheting that down and the complexities of that negotiation. But again, it was sort of interesting for the broad support of the aviation industry, because I think they recognize that millennial and Gen X customers are potential flyers, care about their climate effect. And so aviation had to have an answer to what is it doing about climate change.
That's terrific. And so were you successful in those negotiations while you were at State?
We were. It was actually the one that people thought was a pretty long shot, and was a real challenge. But in fact, we completed the aviation agreement the end of September 2016. I flew to Kigali, Rwanda for the last negotiating session of the Montreal Protocol, and we completed that one. So, probably the two most significant things I've done both concluded 2 weeks apart. So
that's amazing. The most significant thing you've done so
far.
And you also, didn't you have some responsibility for implementation of Paris as well, or for getting more countries to sign on to Paris?
I was part
after
of that.
It had been negotiated?
Part of that overall effort, definitely, and much of the negotiation in 2016 isn't just in these big international meetings, but you have to travel to your counterparts for bilateral negotiations with the countries who are the biggest sticking points or who are going to bring along the most other countries with them. And so we would go on teams to India, to China in particular, but other countries as well, to both push for greater implementation, faster joining of the Paris Agreement. So that it would enter into force. And so that was the third big push of 2016, was to get enough countries to formally join the agreement so that it would kick into force.
And when did that happen?
Same time, early October. It all happened at once.
Which also happened, if I remember correctly, there was an election coming up in the United States.
Was there?
Yeah. And there actually turned out to be a change of control in the executive branch of the United States. And then it obviously has come back 4 years later to the Democratic Party in control. But I'm just wondering, given the very different approaches that the two parties take to environmental issues generally, where do we stand today? Where does the Paris Accord stand today? I know that we had the Trump administration had announced at some point that we were pulling out of it. Why don't we just focus on that one?
Sure.
Where is that?
So President Trump, early in his term, announced that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. By the nuances, the rules of that agreement, no country could formally withdraw until after it had been enforced for 3 years, and then you had to announce you were withdrawing and wait a year before it went into effect. So the upshot of all that was that he did not actually formally pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement until November 2020. And then President Biden had committed to bring us back into Paris on the first day of his administration. So we rejoined in January of 2021. So it was a very small window in which the U.S. wasn't a party.
Okay. And do you know what's happening today with climate change, international negotiations and treaties? My understanding is that there is another phase of this that is going to be coming up sometime relatively soon.
There's a lot going on, and as there should be, and there will continue to be. But the way the Paris Agreement works is every country makes its own voluntary commitment to what it will do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's called its Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. And the round of commitments that countries made when the Paris Agreement was first put into effect were nowhere near adequate for what needs to be done to avoid really serious impacts of climate change. What we're now told by the global scientists is to be basically at carbon neutrality by mid-century, by 2050. So built into the Paris Agreement is every 5 years, countries are supposed to do a stock taking and come up with new commitments that the presumption is, though not the requirement, that they will be more stringent. And so there's an annual meeting of the parties to this agreement. And the next annual meeting of the parties is this November in Glasgow, Scotland. So the British are hosting it. And all the parties to the agreement are to come to Glasgow with new, stronger, nationally determined commitments. So a lot of the diplomacy this year is persuading countries to take on greater commitments. And that is a significant objective of the climate summit that President Biden held a few weeks ago, virtually, but where the US announced its new commitment, which is very ambitious, and several other countries came forward with stronger commitments. We're still waiting to hear from some others, but that's what's going to be happening between now and November in particular.
How optimistic are you that we're going to be able to solve or at least significantly mitigate the climate change, global warming problem?
I'm optimistic because I don't think I have a choice. There's no alternative. But it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. I think on the positive side is that most of the technologies that we need to implement already exist. And so it's a matter of political will in many cases. And a need for decision makers to realize they have to take the long view, and it will cost way more to take no action than to try to take action now. The costs down the road are horrible. I'm also optimistic because of the full-on commitment that the Biden administration is making to the problem, and just seeing the summit and how countries are so welcoming that the U.S. is back at the table. The U.S. Plays an incredibly important role in these multilateral negotiations. And
are we viewed as a leader again? I don't know if we have been consistently the last few years.
Well,
especially after we pulled out or announced the pullout.
I think that they want us to be a leader. They're welcoming us back as a leader, but they're probably still also, waiting to see what we do, or right, waiting to see whether in 4 years we've switched again. But I think we've moved from a point where, especially the major emerging economies, were waiting just for the old emitters like the US and Europe to take action. We've gotten to a point where the problem has reached such a point where every major country knows that they need to do something for their own self-interest. And so, they made some progress over the last 4 years without us, not as much as they would have with us, but they did make some. And then the third reason I'm optimistic and hopeful is how seized by this issue young people are today. They're passionate about it. They're rightly angry and scared, and but they're also throwing their talent and their energy into solving the problem.
You think more than we were when we were picking up litter on the first Earth Day in 1970?
Yes.
Yes, I think so too.
I think so. We were dealing with immediate problems, but they're dealing with an existential crisis.
Yeah. It's their future.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really the future of the planet and the future of the generations.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just change gears as we wrap up here. And I had mentioned earlier that you, a few years ago, gave the commencement address at the College of Worcester. And one of the things in your address, which, by the way, I've read it a couple of times. I think I may have seen you deliver it when you did. And it was just an excellent address to the graduating class from the college. One of the things you were encouraging some people in the graduating class to consider was a career in government. We hear attacks on government all the time. Government is too big. Government doesn't accomplish anything. Ronald Reagan once said, I think it was Reagan who said the scariest words he ever heard were, I'm with the government and I'm here to help, or something like that. I'm probably misquoting that. Do you know the quote, Jennifer?
It's close. You're close. but people drop off the last part. So it was taken somewhat out of context, but people always use it to to sort of show how an attitude toward government as being not helpful
Right.
was.
Right. And so there are a lot of people, obviously, in our country who think that government is too big, and yet you've spent much of your career in government doing a lot of very important work, and you urge young people to consider going into government to carry on either environmental work or working on other issues of importance. Why? Tell me what it is about government service that you find so compelling that you would encourage young people today to give serious consideration to careers in government.
Well, I think that there are many ways that people can find careers of meaning and purpose, but there are so many ways that government is dedicated not only to improving the lives of its citizens, but also, from my work internationally, very much the way that we can, deal with our own national security and protect our people by how we position ourselves in the world, but also being a force for good, such as through these international climate negotiations. But I think that I recommend people look hard at government careers, whether it's your city, your county, your state, or the federal or an international organization, because I think those entities have great responsibility, and to carry it out well, it needs great talent. And it's also just an incredibly gratifying career. The people that I've worked with at Justice, at State, at USTR, at EPA are very smart, dedicated people who get to work on really cool stuff. But another reason I think I encourage people to think about, really making a career of it is, at least at the federal level, administrations come and go, political parties come and go. The career civil service is basically the buffer between wild swings in policy, either direction. And it's the institutional memory, and it's the expertise. And I think that's at least for me, it's been a career of real meaning.
Jennifer, this has been a great discussion. I've always been inspired by you in different ways, and now especially that I have a better understanding of your career and especially the work you've done in government, but also in academia and elsewhere. What do you see as your next act? Where do you go? I'm sure I'm not trying to rush you out of Michigan. Maybe you'll spend the rest of your career there, as far as I know. But what other great thing do you want to accomplish before you call it a day?
Well, Don, I know now from the beginning of this conversation and all the things that we've done the same, I think my next act is probably to do podcasts. So
following in my footsteps.
Following in your footsteps.
If I follow you or you follow me. Well, maybe this will be a good start for you. And I'm sure if you ever do take up that task, you'll probably outperform me by far. But this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I look forward to having a continued connection with you much beyond the next few months or years.
Absolutely. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for asking me.
Take care, Jennifer.
You too, Don.
This has been an episode of Higher Callings. Your host is Donald Federico. Music is provided by Fancy Mountain, and our logo was designed by Matt Pedro. Higher Callings is edited by Brian Federico. Higher Callings is a production of Federico Media, LLC.